Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is part 2 of the news video this morning for the 18th of July 2023. We're going to start with the front line. The front line is a little bit tricky to get great consistent information out of because it's the middle of the war. Fog of war, operational security and all of that. Plus both sides will be trying to present their narrative to control the narrative in terms of what is going on. Russia's troops, says the Ukrainian side. Russia's troops concentrate in 5 directions with 36 combat engagements taking place, and the operational situation in the Kupiansk and Bakhmut sectors is difficult but controlled. Ukraine continues its offensive in the Melitopol and Berdyansk directions. It is interesting to say that there's this whole issue about the Russians being on the northeastern sector, the Luhansk front from Kupiansk down to Crimea. But also, it seems that they are fighting back in Bakhmut as well. Again, this is going to be, how do you read this? And the most positive read of this is it fixes Russian troops in, say, Bakhmut, so that they can't fight elsewhere on the front line, such as Zaporizhia, where Ukrainians really want to make some great advances there. The theory down in the Zaporizhia front line is that the first line of defense, your zero line or whatever you want to call it, where the activities are taking place, the Russians are, they are there. But actually, behind that, in the second and third and sometimes fourth trench lines, they are not manned, right? Because those troops are up in places like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, getting sucked into these places. And then if you're talking about Luhansk, that's interesting. So if the Russians really have amassed 110, 180, 100,000, whatever the numbers are, along the Kupiansk to Crimea or Kupiansk to Bakhmut front line there in the east, then on the one hand, they are offering themselves as a really big threat. But on the other hand, those troops aren't in Zaporizhia. So there's that dynamic. But then, by offering themselves as a threat in this northeastern sector, the Ukrainians, this is their intention, it appears. The Ukrainians have to deal with that. So do the Ukrainians send some of their troops that they were planning on using for the counter-offensive up to Kupiansk area or Svatova area or Crimea area to deal with the Russian threats? These are the sort of dilemmas that both sides are facing, because actually, I guess what the Russians are doing is, rather than throw our troops into an attritional battle in Zaporizhia, let's throw them into a place up here where we're quite well sorted, and it's maybe a completely different landscape as well. Physical geography is different. I don't know. Throw our troops up there, where we are then forcing the Ukrainians to adapt, rather than just throwing them in to Zaporizhia and adapting ourselves to what the Ukrainians are doing. Let's force the narrative ourselves. Let's force, let's take the initiative, I guess is how you might read that. Here's a claim now. A very powerful Russian group is concentrated in the Liman-Kupiansk direction. More than 100,000 personnel, more than 900 tanks, 370 self-propelled guns. And that's what Cherevati has said. He's the Ukrainian spokesperson. It says Tatarigami, the recent counteroffensive in the Torska-Kupiansk axis has come as a surprise to many. However, I have previously written about their preparations for the counteroffensive almost a month ago. Currently, the Russians are conducting extensive training of new motorized units in the southern military district. In order to strengthen our troops, we will need additional weaponry and improved training conditions. I don't mean to doom here, but it is important for analysts, politicians, and military observers to take these warnings seriously. By doing so, we can effectively prioritize obtaining the necessary armament for Ukraine, as well as exert pressure on our own MOD to address internal issues. Now, he's referring back to what he said a month ago, which was, amidst the ongoing counteroffensive, Russian forces are training assault units for their own minor counteroffensive. Given their limited capacity for large-scale offensives, they are likely to focus on smaller company-sized assaults that don't result in any operational breakthrough. With Storm and Storm Z units. So this is becoming a growing worry for some people. Several Russian affiliated channels claim that the settlement of Novosibirsk, which is next to Kuzumivka, has been occupied by them. No visual confirmation yet, but fighting has been going on south of the settlement for 2 to 3 days. Novosibirsk has changed hands quite often. Well, actually, there are claims, and this is what Defense Politics Asia says. There's been a Russian breakthrough west and southwest of Karmazianivka, which is corroborated or at least confirmed somewhat by different sources. So Rebar and Deep State say not quite the same thing, but one might confirm the other. So Rebar pro-Russian source says in the area of Karmazianivka, in the Svatova sector, the storm assault units, with the support of the 21st Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian armed forces, attacked the positions of Ukrainian formations on the opposite bank of the Zherebets River. So where the Zherebets River, one of the rivers coming down, has offered itself as a natural barrier, it appears that they've got a bridgehead or might have a bridgehead on the western side of that. In the course of fierce fighting, the soldiers of the Russian armed forces knocked out the enemy from 2 strongholds at a height northwest of Novovodyanye. And Deep State says, quote, as a result of heavy fighting west of Karmazianivka, the enemy had a bridgehead landing. In addition, the situation in this area requires additional clarification. In other words, we need to find out more about what's going on, which Defense Politics Asia says is kind of French for, yeah, something not great is happening in the area. So that might be taking place, but then that is largely relying on rebar. But it does seem to be that the Russians are causing some problems along that axis. Kenneth Gregg, for what it's worth, and I'll take his claims with quite a large pinch of salt, to be honest. He says we have continued small successes at Kamianetska and Chervono. So this is going down to the southern front line near the Zaporizhia reservoir, as well as Orikovo-Vasilivka in the Bakhmut area, so north of Bakhmut. Many have expressed concern over the Russian concentration of 100,000 men and 900 tanks in the Kharkiv Oblast area. There's no reason for catastrophic thinking or to believe that they will be able to launch a successful offensive. They have the manpower, but it's not up-to-date equipment that they can make use of. Their only reason is to get us to deploy more troops here and reduce the pressure on the Zaporizhia front. We are, of course, deploying more resources to meet the threat, but the task has been assigned to the Home Guard, and that is enough. So this is exactly what I've been wondering, is can they support that northeastern sector, that northeastern axis, with troops that aren't in the counter-offensive pots that they've trained up, all those brigades, 35 brigades, and and the offensive guard and all this. Can they get other troops that are already existing in certain other places, maybe rotating out, rotate them back in to support in that sector? That might be the best thing to do. The risk has been assigned to the Home Guard, and that is enough, he says. Several military experts are beginning to agree with what he said about the southern front, that attrition begins to take effect. There's a high probability that the Russian front will begin to collapse here at the turn of August, September. Lots of different sort of time frames being thrown onto what's going to take place. But when you look at the figures that I shared with you this morning, losing 30 something, was it 38 pieces of artillery? That's eventually going to count. We are currently using 4 brigades out of 12 in the offensive, so we have reserve. So although there are 35 brigades, not all of them, they have different. 9 of them are offensive guard who come and clear out places after the sort of vanguards moved in. Then you'll have mechanized brigades, and you'll have engineering brigades or whatever, artillery brigades. So it depends. If you're talking about who you'd throw into the battle up front, that maybe is 12 brigades, and they're using 4 of them. So they're using a third of the brigades at the moment to do their activities that they are doing. So yeah, we continue to have good luck with our range attacks. I don't think it's luck. I think it's good planning and whatnot. So the question is that sector up in the northeast a worry for the Ukrainians going forward? Russia deploys additional reserves to mount an offensive on the eastern front, says the commander of Ukraine's ground forces. Russia launches an offensive in the Bakhmut sector and Kupiansk sector to regain the initiative. So that's just to show that Bakhmut is part of that as well, as far as the Russians pressuring the Ukrainians. Ukrainian soldiers are successful in the offensive in 2 directions in the south, says the General Staff. In the areas of Malotokmachka to Novopokrovka and Velika Novosilka to Urzhany, Ukrainian defense forces have been successful and are being consolidated on the reached frontiers. At the same time, in the direction of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian military continues its offensive operations north and south of the city. Russian resistance is strong and heavy fighting continues. Velika Novosilka, according to no reports in general. Sorry, this is actually Vasilivka. No, I want to go to Velika Novosilka here. So the Velika Novosilka axis. So if you remember, you've got that kind of L shape to you that will look like that, I think. So Velika Novosilka is kind of in the middle between the Donetsk and Zaporizhia Oblast borders, or on the border. It comes down here. And last night, apparently, Russian troops tried to dislodge the Ukrainians from the northern part of Staromylska. So remember, there were rumors that Ukrainians had taken the whole of Staromylska. Now it's thought that they controlled the north of it. Russians have tried to dislodge them with heavy artillery, but that failed. Ukrainians even progressed a bit into the center. Russians are putting up stiff defense around Pryutne. There are hard battles to be had there, and that's just into the Zaporizhia Oblast. And there are battles around Pryutne where it's sort of being attacked from the north and possibly the northeast as well. So then we come down to the Vasilivka axis, or come across. Here, in general, activity in this area is somewhat decreased. The Ukrainians have made some gains east of Kamyanska, kicking out Russian forces from a stronghold on the other side of the mouth of the Dnipro. The Russians took some area northwest of Verbove, which was initially in the grey zone. That was at what Andrew Perpetua's area yesterday, and I don't know whether that was offensive activity or just a rejigging of the map. So, and I don't know whether No Reports is looking at Andrew Perpetua, whether they have other sources, but interesting. There was also talk, and we'll come on to that actually from Andrew Perpetua. We'll come to that in a second. He also talks about how Russian channels claim that Novosibirsk is in Russian hands. The village itself has been completely razed to the ground and barely defensible. However, there have been fighting just south of it for some time, waiting for visual confirmation. So that's broadly what he said earlier, but just a little bit about it being razed to the ground. The armed forces of Ukraine advanced to the center of the village of Staromylska, says this report using Poulet Volon's map there. Northwest of it and northeast of the village of Urzhany. So there is activity around Urzhany as well, and possibly going into the outskirts of that village. Now, Andrew Perpetua, this is what he's saying. So I've got to be honest, I've no idea how to map the area around Robotna. Anyone who is making really strong claims either has. Sorry. I'm going to be honest, I have no idea how to map the area around Robotna anymore. And anyone who is making really strong claims either has access to serious intel or is full of SH1T, because the situation via open source resources makes no sense. Now, I don't know whether some of his footage is just not as recent or whether the Russians are just in bizarre places. So I'm almost at the point of making a light 3 kilometer thick grey zone and maybe tattooing some big question marks around there, says Perpetua. These videos leave me with extreme confusion. I don't understand. So what he's saying is that where we've got Robotina, and we've said, right, they have crossed the trench lines here. I think it's there, might even be to the south of there. This might be the initial trench line, the large trench lines. We've got Ukrainians having crossed that and in the trenches and etc. etc. He's saying now I've got footage of Russians north of there being under pressure from the Ukrainians. He says they are easy to geolocate. I just cannot comprehend how Russians are there to shoot at. Whether these are Russians that have come from the east, I don't know, behind the Ukrainian vanguard, or whether it's footage that is not from the last 48 hours, or whether it means that the Ukrainians have been pushed right back, I mean, considerably back from where they were in Robotna. I don't know. He doesn't know. So it is confusing. The claims that there are claims that the Ukrainians have expanded their offensive towards Kamyanska. So this is by the Zaporizhia reservoir and the Dnipro River coming in. That Kamyanska is that town that's been separated by the river, with the Russians to the south and Ukrainians to the north, and that's been like that for some time. Well, just to the east of there, there is some advances by the Ukrainians, possibly taking a few strongholds. And then we have Antonivsky Bridge, troops trying to advance eastwards. Ukrainian troops, there's footage of that. Don't know that there's much in terms of gains for either side in that area. Um, but we'll look at that in more detail a bit later. Right, so military aid. Moving on to that. F-16, there's not a lot to report in all honesty. F-16 training hasn't begun yet, but the first groups are expected to depart soon. So this is a big change from people going, oh, it's going to be delayed because the US hasn't given permission. And then yesterday, the US are like, yep, we're going to not only give permission, but we're going to facilitate as best as we can this to happen. So that's going to be with providing elements of the training themselves, or you know, maintenance or airframes or whatever. They are going to make sure that that happens. So that's already good. Um, and there will be a online Ramstein meeting. I guess that's today, actually. So this was announced yesterday. Tomorrow, a new online meeting on the Ramstein format will be held. So that's fascinating. We might see some more equipment coming out of the back of that meeting today. And then just to feed into what sort of troops Russians are using. We've got another account, and these are 10 a penny at the moment. Another account has emerged of Russian convicts becoming ghost soldiers, serving in secret without pay, documentation, or dog tags to identify bodies. They're reportedly forcibly being removed from prisons and given contracts as they're being flown to Ukraine. We can explain. Which is the name of the source, reports on the case of 22-year-old Ilya Kanbekov, who was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for drug offences. His mother says he was taken from the prison and sent to fight in Ukraine with the Storm Z unit. He's since disappeared. Storm Z is effectively a revival of the starring era Straftat penal battalion, a company-sized unit of convicts and possibly some mobilised soldiers being punished for being refuseniks. Storm Z units are used at in high-risk, high-casualty assaults, and basically, these guys just don't exist. There's no documentation of them fighting. If they die, they're disappeared, I guess, missing in action, or just then people don't even know they're on the front line. And what does this tell us? It tells us that the Russians are desperate for soldiers. It's as simple as that, and they're desperate for soldiers to be used in pretty suicidal maneuvers. Right, moving on to geopolitical things, and this I need to look into this because this is bonkers. French TV channel LCI claims that Poland and the Baltic states are preparing to send their troops into Ukraine. According to the TV channel, anonymous sources in the Polish government report that the Poles are now waiting for the final result of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. If it turns out that Russia will win the war in Ukraine, the Poles can introduce the first division already this year. I mean, wow. Whether this is true is anyone's guess. I'm sure they're thinking about this. They must be putting things in place. Like if it all goes wrong in Ukraine, if Ukraine capitulate, and the likelihood of that happening is minimal, given the size of Ukraine and given the resolve of the fighters. But if it all went south for them and the Russians prevailed, then then Poland and some of the Baltic states would be thinking, right, we're next type thing. It's in our best interest to get involved in this fracas, which is a polite word for horrific war. So yeah, but whether that is true, again, I'm sure there are contingency plans. You know, they'll be doing a SWOT analysis as strengths, weaknesses, was it opposition and threat? Opportunities and threats. Come on, Piers. Sort it out. Right. To accommodate foreign military bases in Ukraine, it is necessary to change the constitution, according to Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov. So this is the idea, and I hadn't really thought about this before, but going forward after the war ends, when it ends, if it ends, there might well be, as we saw in Germany and in Korea, there might well be Western bases, military bases. It's not within the constitutional framework, however. It's clear that a legal formula can be found so as not to call the base a base, but some kind of center for interaction and exchange of experience. It is necessary to remove this restriction, which has lost its relevance, in order to destroy the ground for speculation, says Max23. He also proposes to supplement the article on the protection of the sovereignty of territorial integrity of Ukraine with the thesis that Ukraine independently chooses mechanisms to ensure its security, in particular by joining international treaties or organizations. So you can imagine that if they do, possibly when they do join NATO, that you would want NATO bases in Ukraine as a major deterrence for future incursions. Okay, the EU appeals to Russia to resume the grain deal. I reported yesterday the grain deal is off. Russia, well, it possibly was going to be called off anyway due to them wanting to try and negotiate themselves some relief on the sanctions that are hurting their own economy. So they were saying, right, grain deal's off unless you stop this or allow this bank to operate here, etc., etc. So they had these objectives they wanted to achieve, but then with the Kerch Bridge being hit, I think it was like, no, this is definitely off. And yeah, so anyway, EU has appealed to Russia to resume the grain deal, as you would expect. The EU's chief diplomat Josep Borrell, Spanish chap, appealed to Russia on July the 17th to resume its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Quote, with its decision to terminate the grain deal, Russia is further exacerbating the global food security crisis it created by its war of aggression against Ukraine and its blockade of Ukrainian seaports. Absolutely true. Don't know whether rhetoric will solve anything particularly. China has offered to join the negotiations for a new continued deal. China is ready to join the negotiations on the continuation of the grain agreement. This might actually be a useful thing for China to get involved. Some people have said like Chinese forces as independent third-party forces, although they're aligned to Russia to some degree, might be a sensible kind of eventuality in and serve some purpose. I don't know myself, but yeah. China hopes that the Black Sea Grain Initiative will continue to be balanced and fully implemented, says Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning. Final couple of pieces. This is so, as per the Montreux Convention's war clause, Turkey has closed the Bosphorus for warships of all nations. The only ships that can escort grain ships to the Black Sea are the frigates of the Romanian, Bulgarian, and Turkish navies. Now, some people are talking about how, say, American warships could come in and plant themselves in certain places. Well, they can't. The Montreux Convention, Turkey's closed those straits, and only the countries that are within Black Sea, like Bulgaria, Romania, can have their frigates in there. Now, they could do that job of escorting the grain export ships out of the Black Sea. But according to John Kirby, representative of the White House, the export of Ukrainian agricultural products by land will be less effective than by sea. Yeah, you just can't get the volume that you can by sea. But the US will not participate in the military escort of cargo ships. Actually, John Kirby, he's been doing a pretty good job. I might share a video with him where he's railed against people like Tommy Tuberville in the US, who is stopping the military appointment or the appointment of military personnel, high-ranking officials into certain positions. I think there's some 200 positions that need to be filled, and they're being blocked by people on the Republican right who don't want reproductive rights to be given to female soldiers. And John Kirby is absolutely on point. Really good. He gets you can tell because he served in the Navy for like 30 years, I think. But he's like, I've met a load of female people serving and females spouses, and they say this is stopping recruitment and this is making people want to leave or convince their partners to or husbands to leave. This is really serious. And he's like, he goes for it. Actually, it's a really good speech, and that is a problem for US security itself. But anyway, it's slightly off topic. And then finally, frozen Russian assets must be confiscated and used for aid and reconstruction of Ukraine as soon as possible, especially given the need for financial support in 2024, says Ukraine's finance minister. During a G7 ministers meeting, the mechanism is already prepared. There's been lots of different approaches to what to do with the frozen assets. Some nations have been wanting to kind of liquidate the assets and use them to uh, pay for reparations, but there are legal uh, issues with doing some of this stuff. So I think the British have been far more cautious to say we're going to freeze them, and then I don't know, and then thinking, well, then what are we going to do with them? The Americans have more been about turning them into cash and then giving that cash. But one idea that has been touted has been to freeze them. So say you've got $30 billion of assets, just freeze them ad infinitum and say to Russia, until you pay Ukraine $30 billion of assets, you ain't getting this back. So that's a kind of, but then it is just frozen indefinitely. Um, right, that is the end of today's news piece. I really appreciate that. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care, and I will speak to you in my Frontline update, which will be forthcoming. Toodle pips.